All right, in this video, we're going to be talking about how to classify polynomials and write them in standard form. So I'm going to show you this, kind of talk through it, and then do some examples. So the first thing we need to know is that polynomials are expressions that consist of many terms. The standard form of a polynomial must be written in alphabetical order with the highest exponents first. So we'll talk about that when we get to it. In the example that's given, the highest exponent, this 3, is called the degree. When we classify polynomials, all polynomials are classified by degree and number of terms. So we can see this table here. There are more degrees, not really more number of terms, but in other math classes, you'll learn more about those. All right, so in number 1, for all of these, we're classifying them by degree. So what is the highest exponent we see, and the number of terms, which is how many terms do we see. So for degree, we're really looking for variables, and here we don't see any. And because we don't see any, then we can say this is a constant. Because really what would happen is we'd have x to the 0, and thinking back to your exponent rules, or if we haven't talked about that, just know that anytime we have an 0 power, this becomes 1. So we'd have a constant, and then we're looking at how many terms do we have here, which is just 1. And if we look at our number of terms, 1 would be a monomial. And then we move forward. For number 2, again, we're looking at the degree of the variable. It's not shown, but there's an exponent of 1. So with 1, that would be a linear term. Usually anything with an x that doesn't have an exponent that you can't see is linear. And numbers by themselves are constant, but we've talked about that before. And then when I look at how many terms this is, there's just 1. So again, that is a monomial. Number 3, this is another term with an x. So this again is linear, but this has 2 terms. So this would be a binomial. For number 4, when we're looking at the highest exponent, we see this 2. So that would be a quadratic. And then if we're looking at the number of terms, we have 3. So that would make this a trinomial. Number 5, the highest exponent is a 3. So that is a cubic function. And then there are 2 terms. Oh, my marker changed on me. So this is a binomial. Let's try that again. Number 6, our highest exponent is a 4, so that would be a quartic function. And there are 4 terms, so 4 or more is a polynomial. Oops, N. So a way to remember these words, mono means 1. Bi means 2. Or, yeah, just mon means 1. Tri means 3, and poly means more than that. Right. The next part of this is being able to put this in standard form. So as the definition said, it has to be written in alphabetical order with the highest exponent first. So when we go back to this, oops, we're looking for the term with the highest exponent So that would go first, and then you're writing them in decreasing order. So the next highest exponent would be a 1, which we have. And then remember your constants have x to the 0. So that would be our next one. And now we have put this in standard form. If we wanted to go back and classify this, we could say this was a quadratic and this is a trinomial. I'm shortening it. Right, for number 8, the highest exponent is 7x to the 3rd. The next one would be positive x squared. And then we have minus x, and then the constant always goes at the end. The highest exponent here is 3, so this would be a cubic function. And there are 4 terms, so this is a polynomial. Number 9, highest exponent is x to the 3rd. And then 5x squared. Be careful with ones like these. It almost looks like it's in order, but we have to switch the 28 and the negative x. So this again would be a cubic function that is a polynomial. Number 10, the negative x to the 3rd would be first, and then our x. It's okay that they skipped over x squared. We don't need every single term. It's just whatever's given. So this would still be a cubic function because the highest exponent is 3, but this would be a trinomial because there are only 3 terms. 11 and 12 is where it gets a little interesting because we have multiple variables. So 1, we're looking for the highest exponent in ABC order. So A would come first, and that also happens to be our highest exponent. Then we're going in decreasing ABC order. So plus 5a squared, b squared, then plus 2ab. Then at the end, once we don't have any more a's, then we can put minus 2b to the 3rd. Right? Our highest degree would be a cubic function. And this has 4 terms, so that would be a polynomial. And then for our last one, in ABC order, x would come first, and that is our highest exponent. And then decreasing order with our x's, we have negative 7x squared y squared. And then we don't have any more x's after that, so we can put our 5y cubed and then our 13. So this would be a cubic function again, and this would be a polynomial because there's 4 terms. There is more practice on Delta Math as well as Khan Academy on this. Come see me if you have any questions, but use this time to practice.